Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Al Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's program, President Donald Trump announces a 25% tariff on imported vehicles, expanding a global trade war, hammering stocks and testing already strained ties with allies. The Lebanese President Joseph Aoun is heading to Paris for talks on Friday. Ahead of that visit and in line with long-demanded political and economic reforms, Lebanon appoints a new central bank governor. And the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky thanks the more than 20 countries represented at a summit of the Coalition of the Willing in Paris, at which Germany and the UK say that now is not the time to stop Russia's sanctions. Hello and welcome to the program. The US President Donald Trump has announced that he's slapping tariffs to the tune of 25% on all passenger vehicles, light trucks and car parts coming into the United States. Well, President Trump say that these latest tariffs will come into effect on the 2nd of April, while taxes on car parts are set to kick in at a later stage, possibly in May. Well, according to the White House, the US imported about 8 million cars last year. And Mexico is the top supplier of cars to the United States, followed by South Korea, Japan, Canada, and Germany. Well, that announcement of fresh tariffs on the auto sector dealt a blow to investor sentiment on the markets. Shares in Toyota, Honda, and Nissan were amongst those reporting losses. While South Korean stocks also edged lower, dragged down by sharp losses in Hyundai Motor and Kia Corporation. Meanwhile, in Europe, Mercedes-Benz, BMW and Volkswagen stocks took a drubbing as well. Well, Canada's new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, has pledged a $2 billion fund to protect Canada's auto sector from these tariffs. Here's what he had to say.
We will build an all-in Canada network for auto manufacturing components. Because on average, an auto part crosses that border, often through that bridge, over that bridge, 6 times before final assembly. And in a trade war, that's a huge vulnerability.
Well, like Canada, the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has reacted to this news of tariffs on her social media, saying that she regrets President Trump's decision. That's what she had to say there on your screen about those new tariffs. Well, let's get more on this. We can speak to Everett Eissenstat, former Deputy Director of the National Economic Council under President Trump, who joins us now from DC. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Lots of reaction from across the globe. We've got governments from Ottawa to Paris to Tokyo threatening retaliation. What can they actually do?
Well, there's many things, governments can do. Traditionally, when you have these kind of disputes, they can be settled through negotiations. But I think at this point in time, some of the governments are considering retaliatory tariffs, which would be imposing additional higher tariffs on U.S. products. Traditionally, they look to some of the most sensitive products, trying to have the maximum political impact and economic harm to the tariffs. If a country doesn't have the capability, there's some economies that are so small that even if they raise their tariffs to U.S. products an astronomical amount, it really wouldn't equate to much harm to the United States. So they might consider other tariffs, other non-tariff measures as well, including denying preferential treatment of products and other benefits that they might otherwise bestow on those products in their economy. So there's a wide-ranging number of actions that can be taken, and how these governments react will be very important in setting the tone for the next several weeks, because this will be a very volatile period in trade policy, and it could easily have some unexpected consequences.
Okay, well, Germany is a pretty large economy, the 3rd largest economy in the world, although obviously significantly smaller than the United States. And that country's economy minister, Robert Habeck, is calling for a tough stance. We won't take this lying down, he says. And yet we're hearing from President Trump, if the European Union joins forces with Canada in order to do some economic harm to the United States, he says large-scale tariffs, far larger than currently planned, will be placed on them. So what President Trump is saying here, basically, is try anything and we'll hit you even harder. I mean, we've never heard anything like that before, have we?
Well, we have actually. I mean, the president's been pretty clear, even when Canada was going to retaliate on the IEEPA tariffs that were put into place about a month ago on the fentanyl crisis. There was a province in Canada that threatened to raise rates on electricity, and the president was very vocal that that would result in a very significant tariff increase against Canada. So this is one of the volatile dangers that I'm worried about, is that when governments retaliate, they need to remember President Trump wants tariffs. It's not a bad outcome for him if tariffs go into place. So when they retaliate, he simply finds it as a good rationale to counter retaliate and really, I think we'll just end up with higher tariffs on both sides. I'm not saying government should or should not retaliate. It's up to their own decisions. But I think the expectation that will, impose an immediate reduction of tariffs by the United States is probably not accurate.
I mean, do you think it's completely far removed from reality to think there could be a scenario in which former trade allies, partners of the United States, get together, they talk amongst themselves, and they basically try to inflict collective harm on the US economy? I mean, the essence of this is, do you see all of this boomeranging back and essentially damaging the US economy?
I think conceptually what you said could happen. I think practically it won't, because every economy is different and every economy has different interests. And the reality is that I think that President Trump is also willing to engage in negotiations with economies that are willing to actually address some of the market access and other unfair trade barriers that he has identified. So I don't think it's in the interest of every individual economy to do that. I also don't think they have the political ability to do it. There's no real institutional mechanism. And oftentimes, the country's ability to negotiate or to respond in this kind of environment is dependent upon their own political environment at home. And there's just very, very different situations throughout the world. So yes, conceivable, likely, I don't think so.
Okay, so what's the idea here? I mean, what was President Trump trying to achieve? Is this one of his, let's throw it out there, a bit of a grenade that causes a lot of panic and general excitement and newspaper headlines that then starts a conversation that leads to a deal? And if that is indeed the scenario, what is the deal? What is the end game?
So it's a great question, but let's put in context what these tariffs that just went into effect are. These are on top of steel and aluminum tariffs that were announced that were expanded just recently. These are related to autos, and that's one reason why Germany may be so concerned, because some of their automakers are going to be the most exposed. What you're talking about here is one set of tariffs directed towards autos. It's based on a 232 national security statute. The president has said come April 2nd, what he calls Liberation Day, there will be additional tariffs. So we're just beginning this conversation. This is not the end of it. And even if there were a settlement of the auto tariffs, it'd still be the other tariffs coming down the pike here in early April. But yes, fundamentally to your question, the answer is yes. I think there is room for a discussion. I think there is room for a negotiation. And different countries are taking different tacks to do that. We're seeing the United Kingdom respond in one way, and as you said, Germany may respond in another. That's going to be very fact dependent upon which country and how they react, and candidly, whether they're able to enter into a good conversation with the administration on settlement of these trade issues.
Is it a bit early, do you think, to be talking about a trade war? Has the trade war begun?
No, I don't think it's too early to talk about it. We are at the beginning of a trade volatility that hasn't been seen in decades. So I don't know that anybody can really identify exactly what a trade war looks like, but it certainly looks like we're edging that way fairly quickly. And again, just to remind everyone that this is just a beginning. This is on top of the China tariffs under 301, the 232 steel and aluminum tariffs. There's a number of other investigations ongoing under 232, including on copper and lumber. He's talked about tariffs on pharmaceuticals and semiconductors. And then, of course, the big one, as he calls it, the reciprocal tariffs that are coming in April, early April, will really set the tone for a lot of very, very significant volatility. So, yeah, I don't know that we're seeing it today, but we're certainly getting very, very close.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about Germany. Let's talk about Canada for a moment, the ninth biggest economy in the world. I mean, obviously much, much smaller than the United States. The Canadians calling these tariffs, quote, a direct attack. I mean, what is Canada supposed to do? What's the new prime minister, that new administration in Ottawa, supposed to do to appease or placate President Trump here?
It's so complicated because there's dynamics within Canada as well. As you might know, they are in the middle of a potential prime minister election. So the ability for them to sit down and negotiate the political space is very, very small. And in fact, the two parties, as you might expect, are making how hard are they going to be to the United States one of the key factors in the campaign. So I think it's going to be very difficult to find an easy settlement with Canada. Canada and the United States are very integrated. Now, to be, on the other side of the ledger, there's a lot of companies in the United States that engage and have relationships with Canadian importers. They may be seeking for some relief, and if it were to come, that would probably be the most likely avenue, would be through their voices.
And just lastly, I mean, some are calling what we've seen from this new Trump administration a radical change to the global trade order. I'm just wondering if you think that sort of roughly sums it up. And if so, short-term radical change, medium-term, or is this a permanent rearrangement of the world trade order?
Permanent is too strong a word, but I would definitely say long standing. This is, I'd say, decades. We're looking at a decades realignment of the global trading order, and it is happening in real time right before our eyes. It is very dramatic, and it's going to continue. It's we had a very, very stable environment on trade for over 30, 40 years. Now we're into a different kind of a period. I do think we will reach some stability, but it's going to take some time. And once that stability is reached, it will be a different global economic trading system than we have experienced for many decades previously. So yeah, we're headed for a very, very different outcome.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us, Everett Eissenstat. Always a pleasure. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Michael. Take care. Thank you.
In other news, the Lebanese president, Joseph Aoun, is going to head to France tomorrow, marking his first trip to a European country since his election in January. Well, the visit comes as Paris pushes Beirut for long-demanded political and economic reforms. Well, the French President Emmanuel Macron is expected to hold an international aid conference to support Lebanon's reconstruction, following on from the devastating war between Israel and Hezbollah. That's according to Lebanese sources. Well, in a significant move today, Karim Saouid has been appointed as the new governor of Lebanon's central bank, following on from the ouster of Riyad Salameh. Well, let's get more analysis. We can speak to Ronnie, Chatah, who is a political analyst and host of the Beirut Banyan podcast. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Really appreciate it. You're a man who's quoted as saying it's been your life's work to tell the tragic story of Lebanon. And of course, you know all about tragedy because your father, Mohammed Chatah, was a minister, a diplomat. He was killed in a car bombing. I believe a decade ago. And I just want to ask you, looking at all the things that have happened in Lebanon just these last few months, now the country has, well, as of today, a new central bank governor. You have a prime minister, you have a president. It's been a very complicated few months. Lebanon's been at war with Israel. Hezbollah, more to the point, has been at war with neighboring Israel. Does it now feel like Lebanon is at the dawn of a brand new era?
I appreciate this question because in a way it's reflecting on too much that has happened in the last few months. And I'll start by just noting two markers. It's 6 months to the day that it was confirmed that Hassan Nasrallah was killed. So half a year ago, Beirut, the thunder, the echo of explosions, and then the confirmed death hours later of the last militia leader in post-war Lebanon. Post-war meaning not this round, post-Civil War Lebanon. And in 2.5 weeks, it'll be the 50-year anniversary for the beginning of Lebanon's civil war, going back to April 13, 1975. So to put my story with, if you will, my own emotional input here, I think for better or worse, Lebanon as a country, as an experiment, does have a chance to breathe once more. There is a chance at trying to make this experiment work, this communal power sharing anomaly for the region. There is a chance, but I'm one to put skepticism over optimism, especially when it is too soon to see the fate of Hezbollah as an armed group. It is not a political party only yet. It has not joined the club of other former Lebanese militias that turned into political parties only. It remains armed. So I'm not one to jump to any conclusion here. If there is a permanent severing of Iran's security interests in Lebanon and Hezbollah folds as a military wing, if it actually surrenders its arms or finds a dignified way to move on with the Lebanese army or without, meaning that if there's no sub-state groups, I can then see perhaps what Lebanon could look like. And that's the Lebanon that I've been robbed from my entire generation. I don't know that Lebanon. My parents' generation did. They saw it fall apart. And you were mentioning my father up front. That's the Lebanon that he saw as a young man turn into a nightmare. And his journey was one of post-Civil War attempts at two things: sovereignty, which is really what we're talking about, and also reform, which was very, very difficult to do under circumstances that had nothing to do with Lebanon. That includes the Syrian occupation that persisted well into 2005. That includes Israel's occupation of South Lebanon that ended in May of 2000. It also includes Hezbollah dominion in politics, and by extension, Iran, which in effect was a continuation of war. All the assassinations that happened from 2005 until my father's, and unfortunately continued thereafter. That's war. That's not politics. The story of reform, I think, was impossible with that burden. Okay. And that burden, the way I understand it, sorry, just to wrap up, the way I understand it was Hezbollah's paralysis in politics. That seems to be fading. And for that reason, yes, there is a chance, but I cannot bet on the future of this country. I wouldn't do so, even if paid to do so.
Sure, and it's completely understandable given what you've just told us. And as you say, I mean, it's been a very dramatic 6 months to the day, as you say. And, you know, I just wonder how it feels to you as a Lebanese national who's been through all of that and experienced tragedy firsthand. How does it feel to see Lebanon being deshackled or unshackled from Hezbollah, even if that process is not yet complete? How does that feel for you?
Two things I never imagined happening in my lifetime. The killing of Hassan Nasrallah. I did not see that happening. Or for that matter, the severe degradation of Hezbollah as an armed group. What happened in the last few months, going back into September last year, prior to Hassan Nasrallah's death, was in itself shocking. The pager explosions that we all witnessed, whether on TV or here in Beirut, the sound of sirens echoing throughout Beirut, and the disfigured Hezbollah members holding those pagers that are still with us. So all of this happened in a very short period of time. I think it was impossible to see also that Hassan Nasrallah would be killed a week later, or days later, 10 days later. Also, it shows you just how important this group is to not just Lebanon, but Iran and its involvement in regional security, that 2 months later, 3 months later, Bashar al-Assad flees Syria. That's, for me, impossible to see happen, and yet it happens. And then overnight, and what the feeling is really overnight, Lebanon has a new president, as you mentioned up front, a new prime minister, a new government, and also, and you said it right, a new central bank governor who's being debated at the moment. There is a discussion to be had over the nomination process, but the fact is there is a new central bank governor too. A new commander-in-chief, a new way of expressing post-war governance. I did not see any of this possible in my lifetime, and I did not see the end of the Syrian regime in Damascus or Hezbollah as it previously existed. But I have not had enough time to process the emotions, and I don't think I will anytime soon. And I think your question is better asked years from now, how to better reflect on what is just a few months into a ceasefire deal.
Sure, I mean, we don't have the sort of the helicopter view, do we, of these last 6 dramatic months for Lebanon's most recent history. But when you look at, when you sort of talk about all of those things, in particular, you know, the fact you've got a brand new neighbor in a way, in the form of Syria, under a regime that is not the regime of Bashar al-Assad. It's a whole new set of leaders there in Damascus. I mean, does it feel like, if nothing else, here you have an opportunity?
Yes, there's an opportunity. And I think it would be poor form to be cynical for the moment. There is an opportunity. There's a real opportunity. But I do not see the opportunity being seized fully and an end to permanent war unless Iran's intervention in this part of the world is over. And now in that experiment, that window, if you will, of this window of opportunity, if we can go further, I think is not one for war or battles. Israel can deem its security concerns. It can battle Hezbollah. It can fight and kill many Lebanese. For over a year, Lebanon can be at war, and yet the problem doesn't go away for Lebanon. I'm not so interested in the problem for Israel. My interest is in the problem for Lebanon. That problem persists. If diplomacy finds a way to end that problem for Lebanon and the region, and if Iran is given an opportunity to let go of what it has built for 4 decades, over 4 decades, primarily in Lebanon, but extending throughout the region. If diplomacy can't provide a way out for Iran peacefully, then I'll start thinking more optimistically.
Okay.
Short of that, though, I don't see windows of opportunity leading to permanent change for the better. I've lived through that before.
But Ronnie, are you seeing, for example, in you know, the headlines and talking to your political contacts and in your daily life, are you seeing Hezbollah perhaps involving itself less now in the affairs of state and in daily life than they were, say, 6 months ago?
Its capabilities are shackled, and the arsenal in itself has lessened. The threat that it can pose to Israel is more or less removed. At least the way I've seen it play out, Hezbollah is disfigured, not just handicapped, disfigured, yet it can also create security concerns. And we saw that playing out last week on the border with Syria, and Syrian soldiers kidnapped effectively and killed. That can cause problems. And also, if I can express another analogy going back in time with your permission, 1983, for Lebanon, there was an end to civil war. In 1983, months after Israel's siege of Beirut and expelling Arafat from Lebanon, a siege that killed over 10,000 Lebanese in that summer alone, Lebanon had a new government. Lebanon had a new president. Lebanon had peacekeeping troops in Beirut, an international peacekeeping effort. In 1983, there was calm. There was even reconstruction happening in war-torn downtown Beirut. And then by 1984, the civil war resumed. I think the story has to conclude with a finale for all sub-state groups as they exist in their armed expression. If that doesn't end, if Hezbollah remains in this status quo, which you're right, it is degraded and is not able to do more at the moment. But a smaller Hezbollah can also cause problems. And that smaller Hezbollah did cause problems in the 1980s. Sure. Made the group famous world over. That's a Hezbollah that could also threaten the future of Lebanon. So I'm not willing to gamble on that.
Sure, I mean, as you say, Lebanon's experienced a lot of false starts over the years. Of course, your president, Joseph Aoun, is heading to France on Friday for these talks with the French president. The French president wants to hear about progress in Lebanon, and then he might start thinking about opening his checkbook, and other countries might do the same. You've got a new prime minister in place, a reformist prime minister by the name of Nawaf Salam. I mean, do you think President Aoun has got enough progress to show to President Macron to convince him that now would be the time to start giving Lebanon the funds it needs to rebuild?
That's a good question. I apologize for the electricity cutout. Electricity just came back. That's a good question. I can't see a donor conference concluding for the benefit of Lebanon without real reforms happening. I simply don't see it. An IMF deal, I sense, is the only way out, even when local actors and the nominated central bank governor, the new central bank governor, has expressed some concern, and that's being polite, over an IMF deal. But without real reform, without some sense of restructuring, I can't see anyone wanting to give Lebanon money. We had Paris 1, Paris 2, Paris 3. I don't think that will happen again. I think you need reform. And going back to the beginning of this conversation, that chapter, which is in a way able to express itself better once security concerns are lessened, the real battle for reform is underway. You have a prime minister and a president not agreeing on the central bank pick. There was a former IMF regional director, a current IMF regional director, a former Lebanese finance minister, Jihad Azzour, who was not even seriously considered this round. And if he was not being supported by mainstream or reform-minded economists in power or in civil society. The groups that were trying to find an alternative to the president's preferred pick this round, Karim Said, there were too many names, too many missed opportunities, I think, in trying to rally around one pick. And therefore, you have a de facto victory. But that's not a victory that's, I think, over. There is a battle underway of what Lebanon's economy will look like too. And I sense the gravity will always go to a sense of compromise, and that even if he doesn't want an IMF deal right now, I think there will be some push towards one eventually. And I don't think anyone can afford missing this opportunity, because this is the only chance for Lebanon to recover, not just from a war. $11 billion are needed to reconstruct Israel's war in Lebanon against Hezbollah, but the financial crash in the last 6 years. I can't see anyone being that hard on the IMF up front and not willing to compromise later. I think this is a de facto situation. Otherwise, you won't have money coming in.
Just lastly, I mean, I'd love to talk for long, but we're almost out of time. I mean, obviously, the new central bank chief has got his work cut out for him, not least restructuring the commercial banking sector and possibly reimbursing some of those Lebanese people who lost, their savings, their life savings in the financial crash. I mean, clearly the economy has been a nightmare for the average Lebanese person. Hundreds of thousands of people plunged into poverty. Are things showing any signs of getting better? And do you have any hope whatsoever that those people who lost their money will get any of it back?
To be frank, no. I don't think anyone can effectively promise for our money to return. And I think this is a finale. And how you restructure the banks is now the story. You have a new central bank governor that is perhaps more favored by the banks and is less interested in any serious restructuring. You have the reform-minded camp that sees this as a missed opportunity and is vocalizing their frustration today. I think at the end of the day, some measure of reform is needed to bring money back to Lebanon, because without that kind of assistance, you will have perhaps a security nightmare that's fading, but a failed state too. And you don't want that scenario. You want the reform-minded politicians that are now unburdened or burdened less, let's say, by Hezbollah and the threat of violence to actually do their job. I think this is a battle that will play out also in the next few years, and that the prime minister's tenure is fairly short-lived. There's an election next spring into next summer. The president's tenure is 6 years. And I think these picks also, there will be some frustration on the way, leading to effective compromise, which will bring back, hopefully, a sense of trust, at least in Lebanon's economy. The trust factor is gone. Lebanese don't trust their own system. The region doesn't trust Lebanon to hold anyone's assets. That takes perhaps a generation to rebuild. That sense of trust was exactly what my father's generation was part of. trying to bring a sense of normalcy and trust back to Lebanon's economy. Decades later, Lebanon paid a huge price for remaining a regional battlefield well into the civil war's end. Hopefully, going back to the beginning, hopefully my generation, or the next one at least, will see a brighter future. But I cannot bet on a positive finale without an effective conclusion to all security threats in Lebanon that have nothing to do with this country. When you get that over, I think you can bet on a brighter future in all aspects of Lebanese politics, economics, society, etc.
Okay, well, I hope we have a chance to continue the conversation and to speak to you again. But meanwhile, thank you very much indeed for your time today, Ronnie, Chatah, political analyst and host of the Beirut Banyan podcast. Thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure.
Now, the British Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, says that now is not the time to be lifting sanctions against Russia. Well, Starmer made those comments alongside the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky at a summit attended by Ukraine's allies in Paris. Well, some 30 leaders attended those talks in the French capital, at which they discussed how to strengthen Kyiv's position and what role they might play if a peace deal is struck with Russia. Well, today's was the third such summit of what France and the UK call the Coalition of the Willing. Well, the gathering took place after President Zelensky agreed earlier this month to proceed with a ceasefire talks to ensure a resumption of US aid and intelligence sharing. However, Russia has rejected that offer of a full 30-day ceasefire.
We've just had a very constructive meeting, more support for Ukraine to make sure Ukraine is in the strongest possible position, both now and in further negotiations. Second, complete clarity that now is not the time for lifting of sanctions. Quite the contrary, what we discussed is how we can increase sanctions to support the US initiative to bring Russia to the table through further pressure from this group of countries.
That was the British Prime Minister speaking alongside the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who says he agrees with what Sir Keir Starmer had to say. He also says that Russia's President Vladimir Putin is trying to divide Europe and the United States.
No lifting of any kind of sanctions until Russia will stop this war. And I think more pressure on it, more packages of sanctions. This is important. The second point, as you said, Keir, that new packages to strengthen Ukraine, and we heard of some of the leaders' new packages. We are very thankful to all the leaders.
Well, let's get more now. We can speak to Tobias Ellwood, the former British Defence Minister, who joins us from Oxfordshire in the United Kingdom. Thank you very much for joining us, sir, once again here on Al Arabiya News. Just before we crossed to you, we were listening to a clip of the British Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, saying that now is not the time, he said, to be lifting sanctions against Russia. And we heard something quite similar from Germany, saying words to the effect that lifting sanctions right now would be a, quote, grave error. I mean, who are they aiming that message at, do you think?
It's clearly being aimed at President Trump. And everybody in Europe is scratching their heads, wondering where the president is taking the transatlantic relationship, because what we've seen from the very start is perhaps a recalibration of where America wants to take Europe. It started at the Munich Security Conference when the vice president said, Russia isn't the enemy is within, it's within Europe. And now we see all these other messagings taking place of holding intelligence, of also not supporting military aid and so on, and even bringing Putin in from the cold. So the idea of saying sanctions must not be pulled back in any way is absolutely directed at the American president to say we cannot allow the adversary in Europe to get off the hook, because that'll simply give him time to rearm, regroup, and continue his effort to expand influence in Eastern Europe.
Yeah, and the British Prime Minister said all of that and went even further. He said there was absolute clarity, he said, that Russia is trying to delay, is playing games, and we have to be absolutely clear about that. It sounds like, you know, all of those people present in Paris are totally unconvinced by the diplomatic efforts and the overtures being made by the Trump administration to Moscow.
Well, look at those overtures. They started during the presidential election campaign when Trump said he could end the war in 24 hours, that only he had the connections, the power, the influence to bring this to a close. It's clearly not going to happen. Both sides, I'm afraid, are not interested in a ceasefire. I've been involved in many as a former military person. Both sides need to be war weary. They need to be fed up with the war, realizing it's not going to go anywhere. But now you've got Europe leading in to help Ukraine, and you've got Russia thinking, I'm now emboldened because I've got America. I've got the American president supporting me. So there's no chance of a 30-day ceasefire, I don't believe, at all. But there's some big questions for Europe, because if America chooses to dial back as Russia starts to dial up, then absolutely we've got some questions to ask about how we contain European security.
Okay, so if you've got two messages already we've agreed on being aimed at America, one is don't lift the sanctions, the other is Russia isn't serious. Who's going to convey those messages to President Trump? I mean, and how are those messages going to be conveyed to President Trump?
Clearly, all this would be easier if America and Europe were on the same page. But there's a big geopolitical question here that Donald Trump is reinterpreting his relationship with the West, is changing this attitude that America's had for decades, that they lead the West, that they have some sort of duty to uphold the international rules-based order. That's now all gone. Everything is transactional with friend and foe. And we need to explain to the American president, indeed to the American people, how dangerous that is. There's tariffs being talked about today. That would actually impact and hurt America. It's better that we actually work together. The bigger challenge this century is actually not Russia, it's China. And surely we can help America deal with that geopolitical tussle that's going to take place if we're not distracted by potential growing conflict with Russia.
So basically this coalition of the willing, as it's called, that's been meeting today in Paris, not their first meeting by any means, it sort of seems to be working rather against the efforts that are being made by the Americans, doesn't it?
100%. You've got a plan A, which is the Putin-Trump idea that there will be a ceasefire and somehow we'll come to terms with that and everybody go back to where we were. And then there's a realization from the rest of Europe that if we lent into that, if we supported that, it's simply giving Russia the time and space to regroup and do it all again. And that is unacceptable. Don't forget, Putin's long-term ambition is not just to take away 1/5 of Ukraine. He wants all of it. And not only that, he's interested in more of Eastern Europe as well. He wants to rekindle that Soviet influence that his hero, Stalin, actually had. That's what we're dealing with in Europe. Donald Trump doesn't see it under those terms. He just sees the world in a sense of disorder, chaos, if you like, with big beasts around the world. One of them is Russia, that has an interest in Ukraine. The other is America, that has interests in Panama, in Canada, in Greenland, for example. So each has their sphere of influence, like tribes in a jungle. And you respect the other tribes. You don't go into their territory. Unfortunately for Europe, that means we're seeing America actually break away from a traditional support for European allies.
Okay, I mean, obviously there are plenty of people in Europe that President Trump and some in his administration clearly view as being freeloaders. Some they would describe as being pathetic. That's what we've learned in the last couple of days. I mean, the Italian Prime Minister, however, Giorgia Meloni, is someone that President Trump gets on quite well with. And one thing she said that's quite interesting in the last couple of days, she said if Russia doesn't plan to invade its neighbors again, it's unclear why they wouldn't accept security guarantees. So she's made a pretty key point here, which is why do the Russians not like security guarantees if they're not planning to carry out further territorial expansion in Eastern Europe? Do you think President Trump might listen to someone like Giorgia Meloni, were she to be the messenger with these important messages?
Well, I stress, and I say this as a dual national. I was born in New York. I do not want to see this important relationship that's existed for so long was emboldened on the factory floor where we make things together, on the battlefield and in the diplomatic corridors. America and Europe working side by side, that's how we should go forward. But you make a very, very important point. Trump is absolutely right. He said it in his first term, that Europe has not spent enough on European security, and that should change. But that does not mean that America dials back. That does not mean America jumps into bed with Russia, with our adversary. That's the dangerous place that he wants to take this, is to bring Putin in the cold, to rehabilitate his relationship, to remove those sanctions so he can actually not do a deal with Ukraine about those minerals. That's never going to happen. He wants to be doing deals with minerals with Russia. That's his long-term plan. And that is dangerous. And even Italians realize that you cannot trust Russia. We've seen that in Georgia. We've seen that in Crimea in eastern Ukraine, and it'll happen elsewhere. With the Suwalki corridor near Poland, that's now under threat as well. And you've even got Europe, right across Europe, everybody increasing their defense expenditure. Why? Because of the Russian threat.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting talking to people in the new administration in Washington compared to the previous administration, because we're being told the exact opposite of what people in Washington were saying a couple of months ago. We're being told President Zelensky is corrupt, that he's not even the legitimate leader of Ukraine, that elections should be held, that he somehow started the war by having his country invaded by Russia. And we're also hearing, from these leaks and various other messages that sort of get diffused around the world that, as we were saying, the Europeans are somehow pathetic freeloaders. I mean, how do you respond to this claim that we hear time and time again from the Trump administration that this isn't really America's problem and they're fed up with paying this bill? They seem to be saying that they've paid for this single-handedly. It's all their problem all of a sudden, and they don't want it to be their problem. Why can't the Europeans deal with it on their own? How do you respond to all of that?
Well, there's a lot to unpack there, and you're absolutely right. The messaging, the drumbeat that we're getting from Washington has been head-scratching. It's been bizarre to suggest that it's now Zelensky who's the dictator, not Putin, that it's Ukraine that actually started this war, not Russia. This is to turn everything on its head. And Trump knows this, but he's persuasive. And the American people, polls are now showing that they support this new narrative that's come about, this post-truth. But of course, in Europe, we're left to pick up the pieces. We're left to confront wherever this absolutely goes. And everybody is in agreement that Putin will not stop here. He will not be content. He doesn't see Ukraine as a country. He sees this as an old part of Russia, which should naturally fit underneath the Russian umbrella. And that's why, as they say, he won't stop there. He'll use the next couple of years to upgrade his defenses. He's already moved to a war footing, and he's now got China, don't forget, supporting him as well. And this is the wider challenge that the American administration needs to recognize, is that our world's changing. It's getting more dangerous, not less. And leaving us to deal with an aggressive Russia means that we're not there to help America stand up to some of the other challenges that we're going to see around the world.
Okay, so when you hear Washington saying Europe simply isn't pulling its weight, it's got to do more, we're not going to bail you out any longer, how do you respond to that?
Well, on the first bit, he's absolutely right, and I agree with that. But now you're seeing countries increase their defense spending. But I would say directly to President Trump, every time there's been a request for Britain or other nations to step up, we've lost a lot of good people in Afghanistan and indeed Iraq. And in keeping the Red Sea open and tackling the Houthis, yes, there was that attack last week, but the last attack by the Houthis wasn't until last November. Had America asked for British help, we certainly would have stepped up. So whilst, yes, we should be spending more on defense, when it's been called for, we've been there, we've acted, and sometimes we've paid a huge price for it as well. So it's wrong to say that Britain doesn't stand with America. We've been there every single time, much to perhaps the concerns of the British people when they perhaps disagreed with the political reasons why we went into that particular venture as well. So it's, I'm afraid, part of this wider narrative, I stress, of Donald Trump recalibrating his view with friend and foe across the world, putting America's interests first, but really not thinking through the consequences.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm afraid we're out of time. Really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us, as ever. Tobias Ellwood, former UK Defence Minister, thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you.
Well, that is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for a look back at some of the highlights of the past week. Until then, bye-bye.